I always thought my life was picture perfect. I had a loving husband, Mark, and a stable job at one of New York's most prestigious corporate offices. Mark and I had been married for 8 years. While our love wasn't as fiery as it once was, I believed we had something solid, something real. Or at least, that's what I told myself every night before falling asleep. But everything changed on a rainy Thursday evening. The office was nearly empty, with most of my colleagues gone for the day. I had stayed late to finalize a project due the next morning. The quiet hum of the air conditioning and the faint patter of rain against the windows filled the space. I decided to drop the completed files on Ethan's desk. My boss, Ethan, was the type of man who turned heads, tall, broad-shouldered, with a jawline sharp enough to cut glass. He carried himself with a confidence that was both intimidating and magnetic, but I had always kept my distance. After all, I was a married woman, and Ethan was my boss. As I approached his office, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. I knocked softly but didn't hear a response. Assuming he had already left, I pushed the door open and froze. Ethan stood there, his back to me, a towel slung loosely around his hips. Droplets of water glistened on his tan, muscular back, and his tousled, wet hair suggested he had just stepped out of the private shower attached to his office. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry," I stammered, quickly turning away, my face burning with embarrassment. "Emma," his deep voice stopped me in my tracks. "It's okay. I didn't hear you knock." I turned back, unable to stop myself from glancing at him. He was now pulling on a shirt, the damp fabric clinging to his chest and outlining every inch of his physique. I tried to avert my eyes, but it was as if they had a mind of their own. For a brief moment, our eyes met. His gaze wasn't angry or surprised. It was intense, almost magnetic, the kind of look that makes you forget where you are or who you are. My heart raced, and my palms grew clammy. I just came to drop these off," I managed to say, holding up the folder. He smiled, a slow, knowing smile that made my stomach flip. "Thanks, Emma. I'll take a look at them later." I nodded and bolted out of his office, my heels clicking against the polished floor. By the time I reached my desk, my heart was still pounding. What was that? Why did I feel this way? That night, I couldn't get Ethan out of my mind. The way his eyes lingered on mine, the way his presence made my skin tingle. It was dangerous, but thrilling in a way I hadn't felt in years. I told myself it was nothing, just an innocent moment blown out of proportion. But deep down, I knew better. Something had shifted, and there was no going back. If you're hooked already, don't forget to like and subscribe for more gripping stories like this. Trust me, this is just the beginning. I tried to push the memory of that night out of my mind, convincing myself it didn't mean anything. But Ethan was everywhere. In my thoughts, my dreams, and, most dangerously, in my everyday life at work. The next morning, I walked into the office feeling jittery. I avoided Ethan's gaze during the team meeting, focusing instead on my notepad and pretending to take notes. But even as I tried to ignore him, I could feel his presence, his eyes lingering on me. Later that day, he stopped by my desk. "Emma," he said casually, leaning against the edge of my cubicle, his voice low enough for only me to hear. "Do you have a minute?" I nodded, trying to appear composed, though my hands trembled slightly as I followed him into his office. He closed the door behind me and gestured toward the chair across from his desk. "Sit." I perched on the edge of the chair, clutching my pen like a lifeline. Ethan walked around to his side of the desk, but instead of sitting, he leaned against it, arms crossed, his eyes locked onto mine. "About last night," he began. My heart leapt into my throat. "I'm so sorry," I blurted out. "I didn't mean to intrude." He held up a hand to silence me. "You didn't do anything wrong," he said softly but firmly. "I just wanted to make sure you were okay." His concern caught me off guard. "I'm fine," I said quickly, though my voice wavered. He smiled, that slow, disarming smile that had haunted me since the previous night. "Good. I wouldn't want you to feel uncomfortable around me." The way he said it, his tone deliberate and full of unspoken meaning, sent a shiver down my spine. In the weeks that followed, our interactions became more frequent and charged. Ethan would linger by my desk during lunch breaks, asking about my weekend plans. He found reasons to call me into his office for quick chats that always seemed to last longer than necessary. And then, one night, everything changed. We had both stayed late to finish a project. The office was quiet, the hum of computers the only sound. Sitting across from him, going over the final details of a report, I felt the shift when he reached across the desk and placed his hand over mine. "Emma," he said, his voice low, full of something I couldn't quite place. I looked up, my breath catching in my throat as his eyes met mine. For a moment, the air between us felt electric. "I can't stop thinking about you," he admitted, his words sending a thrill through me that I couldn't deny. I knew I should have pulled away, should have told him it was wrong. But instead, I leaned in, closing the distance between us. Our first kiss was tentative, almost hesitant, but it quickly deepened into something desperate and consuming. That night marked the beginning of our affair. We became masters of secrecy, stolen glances in the office, hushed phone calls late at night, and secret meetings in his car. Every touch, every kiss, every whispered word was a rush, a dangerous thrill I couldn't resist. But as exhilarating as it was, a part of me always felt guilty. Mark didn't deserve this. He was a good man, and I hated lying to him. Yet, every time I resolved to end things with Ethan, he pulled me back with a look, a touch, or a word. The breaking point came one evening when we were in Ethan's office. I was sitting on his desk, my legs dangling over the edge, while he stood between them, his hands resting on my hips. We were so lost in each other that we didn't hear the footsteps outside the door. A knock startled us, and we quickly pulled apart, our hearts racing. Ethan opened the door to find one of our coworkers standing there. Her eyes narrowed as she took in the scene. She didn't say anything, but the look on her face told me everything. I knew she had figured it out. For the first time since it all began, I felt the full weight of what we were doing. The risk, the consequences, it all came crashing down on me. That evening, I couldn't shake the look on my coworker's face. Her silence was louder than words, and I lived in constant paranoia for days. Every glance in my direction felt like an accusation, every whisper a judgment. At home, things were no better. Mark had begun to notice my distance. While he wasn't the type to pry, the tension between us was palpable. "Late night again?" he asked one evening as I walked through the door. "Yeah, the team's been swamped," I replied, avoiding his gaze. Mark didn't push further, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. He wasn't a fool. One night, as I sat on the couch scrolling through my phone, I felt him standing behind me. He leaned over and kissed my cheek. "Who are you texting?" he asked casually, though his tone carried an edge. "Just a coworker," I lied, quickly locking my screen. "Mind if I take a look?" he asked, still sounding light, but his sharp eyes betrayed him. Panic surged through me. I had been careless earlier, and a text from Ethan was still open in my messages. I laughed nervously. "It's work stuff, Mark. You wouldn't be interested." He didn't press further, but the doubt in his expression deepened. At work, Ethan tried to reassure me. "She won't say anything," he said confidently, referring to the coworker who had caught us. "She has no proof." But his confidence did little to soothe my nerves. Whispers followed me down the hall, and every interaction felt laced with judgment. Then, the inevitable happened. One evening, Mark came home early. I was in the shower when I heard the familiar ping of my phone. I didn't think much of it until I stepped out and saw Mark sitting on the edge of the bed, my phone in his hand. "Who is Ethan?" he asked, his voice low and steady, his knuckles white as he gripped the phone. Panic surged through me. "Mark, I can explain." He cut me off, standing abruptly. "Explain what, Emma? That you've been sneaking around with your boss? That you've been lying to me for who knows how long?" Tears filled my eyes. It wasn't supposed to happen. I didn't mean for it to go this far. Mark laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "You didn't mean for it to go this far? What does that even mean? You didn't accidentally kiss him, Emma. You didn't accidentally have an affair." I reached for his hand, but he pulled away. "Mark, please. I love you. This was a mistake, I swear." He held up his hand, silencing me. "Don't. Just don't." The pain in his eyes was unbearable. He grabbed his keys and left, slamming the door behind him. That night was the longest of my life. I sat on the couch, replaying everything in my mind, trying to figure out where it had all gone wrong. I wanted to blame Ethan, to say he had seduced me. But deep down, I knew the truth. I had made the choice. The next morning, I went to work feeling hollow. Ethan tried to talk to me, but I brushed him off. "It's over," I said coldly. He looked hurt, but I didn't care. I had already lost too much. When Mark finally came home, he didn't say a word. He grabbed a few things and left again. I didn't stop him. What could I say to make things better? The house felt emptier than ever without him. Weeks turned into months. I resigned from my job, cutting all ties with Ethan. At home, I packed away reminders of my old life, photos of Mark and me, the trinkets we had collected. Slowly, Mark and I began to communicate again. It started with polite exchanges, but gradually, the walls came down. One evening, he came over to talk. "I'm not saying things will go back to the way they were," he said, "but I'm willing to try." Tears streamed down my face as I nodded. "I'll do whatever it takes." Rebuilding our relationship wasn't easy. It took time, patience, and painful conversations. But through it all, I held on to the hope that we could find our way back to each other. Looking back, I know I made a terrible mistake. I hurt the person I loved most, and there's no excuse for that. But I also learned the value of honesty, communication, and not taking love for granted. If there's one thing I'd say to anyone listening, it's this: don't let fleeting moments of temptation destroy what truly matters. And if you've enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more powerful and emotional tales.